Hey, everybody, and welcome to the Ethics Experts. If it's your first time joining us, we're so glad you're here. And if you're subscribed to the Ethics Experts, it's so great that you joined us today, and we're going to have a great time together. And see, that's what you get. If you subscribe to the Ethics Experts, on every episode, you get an extra and a special and an extra special welcome. On this episode, we're going to be talking with Tobias Sturesson about his book, The You Can Culture. We talk about his journey from growing up in a community that became a cult, to his understanding of culture and a lot of great studying that he's done, to the impact that he's making to help organizations build better cultures. We're going to be talking about psychological safety and speak up cultures. We're going to be talking about creating rituals and celebrating behaviors, what to do about microcultures that develop around negative behaviors, and just what you and we as leaders need to do to be humble, to be honest, and to understand our vulnerabilities so that we can build a culture that is a habit that has a powerful impact, not just on the people in our organization, but on us achieving the mission that is the core outcome of our culture. Let's get into it.
Welcome to the Ethics Experts, where we're elevating ethics and compliance and HR to the strategic level it's supposed to be.
So let's get into it. We're having a great conversation today with Tobias Sturesson. Welcome to the show, Tobias.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here too. So Tobias is co-founder of Heart Management, and he and his team have a vision for a world free of destructive workplace cultures. So that's definitely something that I can get behind, and a lot of the fans and subscribers to the Ethics Experts can get behind. And Tobias, today we're talking about your book about You Can Culture, another topic close to my heart. You go into a bunch of great things in this book around how leaders can address their blind spots, be more humble, be honest about their culture, how we can celebrate the right behaviors, how values mix into this. And I really thought it was an awesome book. So I encourage everyone who's listening, you're going to get some great snippets from this book today and from Tobias, but you got to read the whole book. It goes in depth. It has a bunch of applicable action items and ways to make a change on your culture. So whatever type of leader you are, you hear us say on the Ethics Experts that everyone's a leader. You don't need a title to be a leader. You just need to care and be willing to influence people. You got to check out this book on You Can Culture. So Tobias, just when we get in here, tell us a little bit about your background and how that played into the book here. As I hand it over to you, I want to thank you for being vulnerable and authentic. I think those are keys to good leadership and a good culture. And you really open up in this book by bravely sharing some things from your background that have really shaped your vision about the world and about culture. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for that amazing plug for the book. And so I start in the book as you just said, with telling a bit of my story and why I became so passionate about this topic, and so my story really goes to going back many years ago, growing up in a Christian community that over time really turned into a religious cult, and where the leader of this environment, I mean, we were all very excited to be a part of this. It was this great vision that our family really connected to. And then over time, it became more and more isolated, and the leaders started to kind of point out and demonize and isolate people and different people. And ultimately, my mom, who was the leader in that environment, became one of them. And so she became demonized, isolated, and ultimately she tried to take her own life repeated times to really escape the terror and the trauma of that environment. And ultimately, she ended up in a psychiatric ward, and it took her, I think, 1.5 years until she was able to get out of there. And I mean, I grew up in that environment. I also was an adult in that environment. So I became complicit in that. And I've wrestled so much with those questions, both in terms of how could an organization that is seemed driven by this noble mission turn into something so toxic? And how could I, who saw myself as an ethical and values-driven person, become complicit in psychological abuse? And of course, my story, I think, is more on the extreme side. But what I've seen, and what I'm sure you've seen as well, is that yes, in most cases, it doesn't end up that extreme. Most organizations don't turn into cults, but the same type of issues and so on show up in corporations, in governmental organizations, in NGOs around the world. And I really see this epidemic of unhealthy culture that leads to dysfunction, that leads to division, that leads to unethical behavior, and so many other things. And that has tremendous impact both for the people affected, but also for the financial success of the company. So yeah, I guess that's an introduction to it.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm sorry to hear that you and your mom and so many other people went through that. But I think it's valiant the way that you've taken that experience and the things that you've learned from it, and you're sharing them with us here on the Ethics Experts. You're sharing them in your book to make a positive difference in the world. And I think it's great how you've been able to go through that. And I think that I think part of being a good leader and building a good culture is that self-reflection and realizing where you are compared to where you want to be. And it's clear that you've done some of that and said, hey, you know what, this is the direction I want to go in. And I think that it has a lot to offer our audience today because, like so many things, when we can study, or when, in your case, you experience such an extreme version of something, right? There was an extreme culture there that was extremely toxic and destructive. Well, there's a lot to learn from that. Just, that's why people like the Olympics, because that's a great example of working hard and being competitive, or, sports, or, the Nobel Prize or whatever it is. There's a lot to learn from these condensed areas. And even, you can learn from the negative and the positive examples. So I appreciate you sharing with us today. So let's talk a little bit about, that this distinction between like a cult and culture. Because, you mentioned how this, this organization, this Christian community you were involved with, transformed from one thing to another. And, I imagine it was some actions that became some trends, that became an environment, that then became a solid culture. And talk to us how that can teach us something about the flowing changes that happen in our own corporate cultures, because, none of these things are static and set in stone.
No, and that's really, really great question, and how that forms. And I think, when we reflect on culture and what culture is and how it works, I think culture, it's shaped to handle uncertainty. So as we come into a new environment, we look for the signals that will tell us what will make me succeed here, what will make me feel safe here, what will make me feel successful here, and so on. And those signals will shape behavior and so on. And I think that's exactly, you start to look for the clues of what will make you successful, and then you have a leader who over time increasingly is the one who defines those clues. And of course, in a religious environment, they also then speak for something, speak for God, speak for a higher power. So of course that becomes even then more powerful in terms of shaping culture and shaping those signals. And then when you start then create, and I think that is something that you can see in many organizations as well, that you create this image that we are the ones who have the solution. We're the ones who have, all the other people are part of the problem, or whatever. And I think in a company, we can look at the regulators, they're the problem, and we start to create kind of this us versus them type of environment, which also leads us to pull more inwards and to not really listen to the signals from the outside, and become more isolated, and also sometimes I think become even more extreme than in our culture, in our cultural expression. And I think as well, something that, and I've talked to so many leaders who have been in an environment, and when they come out of that, they think, oh, how could I have been a part of that behavior, been a part of that way of thinking? But when you're in that group, when you're trying to fit in, those signals are so strong, and that pressure becomes so strong. And that I think that is something that is true, whatever type of organization you find yourself in.
Yeah, it's it certainly is the sum of all of those things. I love what you said, that it's built to handle uncertainty, but also, in some ways that can be reactive in how it's formed, or it can be pushed by somebody, based on their values. So, you share this definition up front about culture being shared beliefs and assumptions that shape behavior. What do you think is distinct about that? Or what do you think people get wrong when they conceive of their own culture or their own definition of that? Because, I've heard a bunch of people say, it's like we all know what culture is, but everyone describes it differently.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think here, of course, Professor Edgar Schein's work is really, really fundamental here, and I think understanding that there's so many things that are underlying the things that we see, and that to really understand our culture, we need to go below what is, because I think no matter how much we say that, organizations still assume that, or say that culture is important and that it's deeper and all of that. Organizations often still just assume, oh, we have a great culture, we have a healthy culture, and so on. But they don't really look at what are those underlying assumptions and beliefs that have really shaped the culture. And I've seen so many times how those underlying assumptions and beliefs about what has made us successful can really become unhealthy, and they can become something that hinders. And that might be, for example, that is just, thinking that keeps us away from innovating, from trying new things. But they can also be things, beliefs about who we are as a group, beliefs about who the outsiders are, that then also shapes. And I think we can see that in so many examples. I mean, just one that I'm thinking about on the top of my head is France Telecom, for example, really this terrible story, and Professor Guido Palazzo has been researching that quite a lot and written on how they created this they needed to get rid of a lot of employees. They needed to downsize the organization. They couldn't do it according to French labor laws. So they started to create really this story of how they had certain people in the organization that were the dinosaurs, and how the dinosaurs went extinct, and how they started training up managers to identify people who they wanted to get rid of, and then make life as hard as possible for them so that they would leave voluntarily. And ultimately, a lot of people did leave. Some as Guido Palazzo says it, some through the door and some through the window, and many people actually ultimately took their lives because, for example, they might be working as an engineer, and suddenly they were put in customer service without receiving any training, or they were taking care of their sick parent, and suddenly they were moved to another city where they wouldn't be able to do that. So and I think what that just shows is how we can kind of create these stories. We can create these ideas that will shape culture and that will shape a behavior that can have really detrimental effects if we're not really careful with what those stories are, what those beliefs are, what is behind those assumptions, and if we just assume that is healthy.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the, I don't know if it's insidious at times or it's at least challenging, is there's so much about culture that is unintentional, right? There's something that we say here that, if you don't build your culture, then someone's going to build it for you, because sometimes it just happens. Sometimes you can get caught off guard by the culture that you're building. But also in an example like that, you can be going for something, right? And, we can certainly debate or disagree with like the morality or the how just that approach was to be squeezing out the dinosaurs. But there are also a bunch of unintended consequences that come from that. I imagine all the people who even weren't dinosaurs were like, this is becoming a really toxic place to work. Even if they're not trying to run me out, I got this person that's crying, or this person's dissatisfied, and am I going to be next, and all of those things. And I think that's one of the most challenging things about culture, is how it can kind of get out of control, or, things can happen that you don't see coming. So maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the, you talk about kind of the illusion of the values-driven organization motivation and ethical fading. Talk to us about how people can get it wrong, and maybe they think they're a great leader or building a good culture, and things either slip away from them or they're just wrong about it.
Such a great and important question, and so a story that I tell in the book that I think is really revealing is the story of the Swedish customs office. So you have a person, he had felt that he had been treated in a racist and sexist way by this person working at the customs office, and that was when I was researching the story. That was a court case, so we don't know what was really true. But anyway, a journalist at a large Swedish newspaper contacted an official, a senior official at the Swedish customs office, and asked her, "So could this have happened in your organization?" And she answered that, "Oh, we have these values that say that we should be professional, that we should treat everyone equally, and so on." And then the journalist pushed forward and asked, "So that does that mean that you can't do anything wrong?" And she answered, "Yeah, I think that's what it means." And another journalist asked me about this, and I remember he wrote in the article, like, "Can a few set of words make employees perfect?" And of course, I think we all laugh at that story, and it sounds just ridiculous. But at the same time, I think we see time and time again how we make these assumptions about, oh, but we're the good company with the great values and so on. And then we work so hard, and with employer branding, with all of that, to show that face to the outside world. Like, so many companies spend more on communicating about their sustainability initiatives than they spend on their actual sustainability initiatives. So we work so hard on creating, and I'm not saying that's unimportant. Of course, it is important. But what I think is so important for us to see, that there's something that's going on in their kind of inner life, the heart, the culture of our organization, that so many times we overlook, and which really creates this discrepancy that the people within our organization will feel. They feel that it's not integrity between the things we say, the things we want to communicate, and what is truly real within the organization. And suddenly we've created this image of our organization. I've worked with several organizations that have gone through high-profile scandals. And in many of those cases, I can see how there were, allegations, there were red flags, there were things that they should have listened to, but they were so focused on protecting the image of our organization, how great we are, what a legacy we have, that they weren't ready to listen. So they missed the signals, and they ended up in deep trouble because of it. I'm thinking, for example, also on a conversation I had with Hiltrud Werner, who came into Volkswagen after scandal as the ethics and compliance leader and part of the management board. And she told me publicly on a podcast, she said that the perspective at Volkswagen at the time was, we're the benchmark. Why should we listen to anyone? And I think that's exactly the issue. So when we have that health illusion, whether it's for us personally as leaders or for our organizations, we're not listening. We're not seeking out the information that shows us where we're vulnerable. And so I think we need to take another approach and just assume that we are vulnerable, and then start looking for, okay, so what are the blind spots? What are we not seeing? And how are we humble with the fact that we will get things wrong, we will get off course, and then if we have that humility, then we can course correct, we can listen to the signals, and we can learn.
Yeah, I love that. It's, I love the way you describe it. It's an unfortunate stance of things, but I think it's true that it's almost like, as leaders, we can set our own trap, where the more we talk about this stuff, the more we push it, the more we pay a PR agency and an internal trainer to go over this stuff, the more we can fall into that confirmation bias and convince ourselves that I've put so much effort into this, that conflicting report that someone gave that conflicts with my idea of what our culture is or should be, it's maybe easier to ignore it the more dedicated you are to this. And that's why I love, so, in, the first half of the book, you talk about the need to be humble, right? You just mentioned that we need to recognize and admit to ourselves that we are vulnerable to getting off track. And you talk about how as leaders, we need to be humble. Talk to us a little bit about why that's so hard and what we can do to kind of deconstruct that for ourselves or have the people around us help us with it.
Yeah. And I make the distinction that really in the book, I talk about getting humble. I talk about it as a practice. And I think that's important because otherwise we just think about it as a character trait that we have or we don't, but that it's actually a practice. It's actually something we choose in every situation. We choose to get humble. And I think, and I work a lot with leaders, with executives, and what you see so many times is that people are so afraid of getting humble because we want to, protect our authority. We have certain pride. We want to protect our position in the group. So we don't share our mistakes. We don't talk about our challenges. And I've seen it so many times, and how people are struggling with really, really severe things, but they're not talking about it. They're not asking for help. They're not getting the attention to these issues that they needed, and the consequences of that are so big. And I think it really comes down to that really fear of losing authority, fear of being seen as weak. And even though, we've had, Brené Brown and all these voices that have been telling us that to learn that this is courage, still, that's not what it looks like in most management teams or boardrooms or even at lower levels in organizations. And I really think that to see a change, it really needs to be modeled. It really needs to be modeled by people who show what that looks like. And I've seen it, and I've seen how the action of getting humble, I've seen it in situations, where there's been this incredible lack of trust because of leadership issues with former leaders and so on that have really ruined trust in the organization. But when the new leadership were willing to take ownership of what happened, we're ready to admit it, we're ready to apologize for it, we're ready to listen how they could restore trust. But it took that humility. So that's why I see it as the fundamental habit to build a thriving and ethical culture, because without it, we're not going to do all the other things because we don't have the right heart, we don't have the right starting point.
Yeah, that's great. I love that point that you have to act humble, and being humble is a practice. It's not a character trait. It's not like you are or are not, it's, are you acting that way? And you make the point so clearly that it needs to be modeled, right? And, we can model it for ourselves and say, hey, going into this meeting, I'm going to be vulnerable. And we can, hopefully people on our teams, if we're leaders, can see us model that, and then they can pick it up and feel more comfortable doing it. But, whether it's we're going through a crisis and I'm talking about, hey, this is hard for me, it's hard for me to deal with and I'm worried about it and things like that. And it's okay if you feel that way. Or, I think it can at times feel like an extension or, a stretch to be modeling how difficult it is to live our values. I think so many times leaders feel like they have to say, well, whatever the value is, integrity or accountability, or like, well, of course, everyone should do it. You just got to do it. But to me, if we're picking values as a leader, we should pick things that need action and decision behind them, which means that there's an alternative, which means that there's probably going to be some conflict, and say, hey, you know what? It's kind of hard for me to be accountable for this right now because I wish I didn't do it. Or I feel like, it'd be nice if I could blame it on someone else, but I got to take this. And I think if we as leaders can realize that it needs action, and we need to show people that it's not always easy to do it, but I'm going to choose this value, then those values become not just something on a poster or something in a slick PR campaign, but something that people say, okay, I guess this is a place where we choose that over something else.
Yeah, and I think that's so true what you're saying. And I say in the book that values that aren't allowed to cost us something aren't worth anything either. It's at the point of where it becomes where it takes a risk, where it costs us something, and it doesn't have to be monetary. It might cost us something, cost our pride, our comfort, something. That's the point where people really see that we're standing up for something that is actually really valuable to us. And I think so many times we just want to, choose something that sounds a list of things that sound good. But if you think about a person that you think is really values driven, or that you look up to for standing up for something, the point where you saw that they did it even when it was costly, that's the thing that signal that it actually matters.
And it's embedded in the name, right? Their values, right? Things are valuable because they cost a lot, right? A diamond is valuable because it costs a lot of money to buy it. And our values are not just things that we think are nice. They're things that there's a cost to doing it, but it's so worth it that it's worth paying that cost, because it's worth even more than the cost of that discomfort or the extra time that it takes or whatever it is. I think it's so important to realize that, because a lot of times I think as leaders, we can be focused on promoting it or explaining it or telling people about it. But the real action comes from realizing, hey, this is not going to be easy. This is going to be costly, but I'm going to do it. So along those lines, how do we, I'm thinking about how do we recognize and appreciate and live out something that's valuable? Some of it is celebrating it. So you talk about how part of the way that we can build this UCAN culture is to celebrate the right behaviors. So talk to me a little bit about why that's important, and like, what are some things that people can do? Maybe they're not the CEO or the chairman of the board telling the whole organization how they need to do everything, but maybe they're a middle manager, or they run a team or a division. How can they build some of this concept of celebrating values into their team so that they actually choose the right behaviors?
Great question. And before answering that, I just want to just take a step back to say that something that's really been a fundamental revelation for me, I would say, in my work, is that so many times when organizations think about changing culture, we end up in these projects. We end up with this idea that we, for example, if it's an ethics issue, we delegate it to ethics and compliance or to HR or something, and they should drive a project most of the time, where we have this kind of tick the box training or something like that. But the thing is that just like with our physical health, culture is not built on those short-term initiatives. I'm not saying that they don't matter, but it's the habits, it's the things that we repeatedly do, the signals we repeatedly send. And that it goes for the tone from the top, but it goes from the tone from every level within the organization. What are the signals we are sending? And that's why leadership habits are so important, and at every level of the organization, that we that we signal that the right behaviors are encouraged in our organization. And of course, one of the ways we do that is through celebrating positive behaviors, and I think the idea that the behaviors that we celebrate will multiply. And I think that this is really something that you can do at any level within an organization. I mean, sometimes hearing something from a colleague that I really appreciated that I'll just take that again. I think, for example, sometimes hearing it from a colleague that you really did something that was really important, meaningful, and so on, that can mean as much or sometimes even more than hearing it from your manager. But I think when it comes to celebrating good behaviors, I think so many times we just assume that we do it. But there's a lot of the research that I looked at where they look at if people actually feel like they are receiving that that recognition. Most people they don't see that, and they feel that if they would be willing to work harder, they would be more aligned with the values of the organization. And I just make the recommendation to be genuine, specific, and timely. And I think those three things are really important. And then you can do it in so many different things. And I mean, I just actually yesterday I was with a group of leaders, and where one manager, he had started to do it in this way, that every week his team would kind of give would choose someone they wanted to give a star to, and it was not a physical star, just kind of something they talked about as a team, and to say, like, this is a behavior that I've seen that I really appreciate, and that is really connected to the culture that we want to build here. So of course you can do it in so many different ways, but I think the thing is being intentional and consistent with doing it, and just thinking about what are the behaviors that are important to us and how do we celebrate them in the best way. And it doesn't have to be balloons and cake, but it can be that simple, I saw what you did, I recognized it, and it really matters to our organization. And I think, of course, that's when we talk about ethics or something like creating a speak-up culture, for example, that becomes so incredibly important. And then also showing the organization that when people speak up about things that were uncomfortable for the organization, that was actually valued, that was actually celebrated.
Yeah, it's great. I love how you talk about being genuine, specific, and timely. You need to take these actions. You need to do them consistently. And listen, I love balloons and cake as much as the next guy, but there's a lot of research around just the verbal, the social recognition has a lot of psychological value for people. And you make a great point, Tobias, that it reminds me of the quote that I think is attributed to Aristotle, but he says, "Excellence, we are what we continually do. So excellence is not an act, but a habit." So replace excellence with whatever your value is, right? Sharing, integrity, hard work, whatever it is. Those things are not an act. They're built by a habit. And, I think that what we all can do better is make a habit out of that recognition and that celebration.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you talked about a speak up culture, which, is super critical for ethics experts and, ethical organizations. So, you talk about brave conversations and setting the conditions for people to have those conversations. Talk to us about those brave conversations and how much they should be in a specific setting and time versus something that, is kind of sprinkled throughout the organization, and how that ties to building a psychologically safe organization.
Yeah, great questions. And I think to take a step back there, I really talk about this habit that I call to get listening, and talk about soliciting feedback, and, as you say, create this conditions for brave conversations. What I think so many times is that as leaders, we don't really recognize the power that we have, and we don't recognize how that impacts people. We don't recognize that it's a lot harder. And for example, Professor Megan Wright has done really interesting work on this, how much more we assume that we're good at listening than what we actually are, and how much harder it is for people to actually speak than what we assume that it is. And having that understanding, I mean, I've heard so many leaders say things like, oh, these people, they just never have anything to say. But we haven't really created the conditions for them to say something. And I think that there's so many things that we can do there tactically. For example, I mean, things I encourage leaders to do it. So, for example, if I would come up and present a strategy, for example, instead of saying, if anyone has a question, please, please speak up. And instead of doing that, for example, saying, I know that there are lots of questions here, and so please share with me your concerns, or we're going to take 5 or 10 minutes right now, write down the concerns you have, and then we're going to discuss them together. So asking like what and where, not if, is something that we can do. And I also think in just the way of how we organize our meetings, how we think about how we position ourselves as leaders. Of course, the question asked, how we handle silence. So many times when we ask something and we don't get a direct answer. We step in, we start talking, we fill the room with our words. But sometimes it's really, really helpful just to stop and let it be silent and let people have the time to reflect, to think, to give their perspective. Another thing that I really, and this really comes down to rituals, really how we create rituals that will build our culture. And one thing we've encouraged many teams to do is for example, to on a regular basis to have conversations where you ask, okay, where have we as a team, as a leadership team or a team acted in line with our values over this past week or period, and where have there been issues or concerns, and what are some dilemmas that we're facing that really need to have robust conversations around. And so many times I think when you start trying to have those conversations, it's hard from the beginning. But if you train yourself to do that repeatedly, then suddenly that will become something that is just second nature to you. You're going to talk about dilemmas. You're going to talk about the ways you're not living up to You're going to talk about the ways you're not living up to the values, and you're going to start seeing things that you didn't see before. So there's so much we can do, but we all so often we just get stuck in faulty assumptions about this group or about ourselves as leaders. And there again, we need to realize, and I love, for example, the idea of objections and rationalizations, and I'm drawing here from Professor Mary Gentile and her work in giving voice to values, and she's been a great collaboration partner and inspiration in my work, and she talks about, for example, the idea that we think, oh, this is not going to make a difference, or this is going to have negative consequences, or this is out of my level of seniority or whatever. And as leaders, we need to think about those objections and rationalizations and ask ourselves, so what can we do to get beyond them? What can we do to ensure that when people bring things up, that they're not going to feel like it didn't make a difference? And for example, one thing we can do is to make sure to always reconnect, whether we decide to do what people say or not, still reconnect so that they feel, okay, something is happening. They're actually responding to what I'm saying. And so, yeah, or being grateful for the feedback we get.
Even if you don't like it, right? Even if you don't like the feedback, you got to be grateful for the feedback, right?
Exactly. Yes.
But sorry, keep going.
No.
Yeah. So there's so much that you're talking about that really ties this all together. You started out by saying early on that that culture is built to handle uncertainty. And I think that we as leaders so frequently want to rein it in and say, these are the values, this is how you have to do it, when really there's so much uncertainty around us just saying the obvious thing that everyone probably knows they should do. And what I find is engaging with that uncertainty, right? Opening the room up to questions when you haven't planted things and you haven't, and a question might come up that might throw you off or be hard to discuss. Engaging kind of on those edges of that uncertainty is where you can bring things in line with your culture. And you can't shy away from those things. So you have to be open to something that might make you uncomfortable, or someone might bring something up that reminds somebody else that, yeah, they don't like that as well. And, you can have, an increase on the negativity meter or something. But, right, this is culture, right, which, is related to the word cultivate. And if you're cultivating something, there's some organic randomness to it that you need to try to, bring harmony to. And if you're going to cultivate that culture, you can't just stay in, walking down the dotted line in the middle of the road. You have to be able to engage with those edges. And when you see and show that those people who have a question or are opposed to something or bring up a natural conflict of, hey, it's kind of hard to live that value out right now. I think engaging with those things, whether they're rituals or brave conversations or one-on-one discussions you have with people, are things that end up shaping your culture so much more than a highly produced video that comes out from the PR department.
Yeah. So incredibly true. And I also think this really ties in, I think, to the conversation on compliance and ethics. And in terms of that, when it comes to creating a culture of ethics, I think so much, because that's where we're in this space where we don't necessarily have the policies, or we don't want to state the policies. We want people to actually more think about how should they act, what is the right thing to do, because as we know, things can be lawful but still awful. And so we want people to actually exercise that muscle of actually reflecting on dilemmas, challenges, tensions, and so on, and think about what the right thing to do, and not do that alone, but do it in community. And one of the really helpful things that I've seen is really to create kind of peer learning groups in organizations. I think so many times we don't really use the wealth of experience that we have within our organization, but getting leaders together in smaller groups that are maybe cross-functional and letting them create the safety together as a group and have conversations about the issues that they're facing, the dilemmas, the tensions they're facing, and getting to hear from others. For example, I've some of these groups, for example, a group that I've worked with, or whether they'll be a group of country managers, for example, and for them to be able to discuss. So when you're doing business in China or whatever, these are tensions and things how do we deal with this? And where you can do that in a safe environment, then we can train up that muscles. We can train up that ability to reflect, that ability to be, because the issue is, I think, that in the day-to-day work life of so many managers and people in general, people are super stressed and they don't have the time, or they don't take the time to reflect. So one of the things of creating space for reflection together as teams, but also for people individually to think about their leadership, think about how they're living out the values, think about the dilemmas and tensions they're facing, and having conversations, robust conversations about that. I think that's really where creating a culture of ethics lies in so many ways.
Yeah, that's great. You get so much out of that. You kind of let those different perspectives bump up against each other, and they end up sharpening each other and polishing each other. And you really get some magic out of that you can't really script, right? You can't make them fill out a survey or answer some questions where the answer is obvious in order to get that. But by them fusing their personal, actual conflicts and struggles and questions, speaking those, hearing that reflected back that, yeah, I've had something similar, and working through those together can really build a strong bond among people in the organization. That's great. I love that kind of getting people together and having them work those out can be a great way to build culture. So we maybe have time for one more question. I'd love to kind of flip this. We've spent a lot of time kind of talking about the positive side of, what you can do to promote a good culture and define it and, set a great environment. So maybe talk to us a little bit about how we can kind of push back against negative influences on culture. We started talking about a negative experience you had with a culture personally. And a lot of times, whether it's a peer or, we're a more senior leader and it's somebody in our downline, we know that there are people that are doing things that are unethical, or maybe not blatantly unlawful, but it's not in line with our culture. So what are some things that we can do as leaders to influence the culture when there are destructive behaviors that are maybe pushing against, or even, threatening the overall culture, or creating a microculture that's going to be problematic?
Great question. And so I said before that the positive behaviors that we celebrate will multiply, but I think on the flip side that the negative behaviors that we turn a blind eye to will spread. And I think so many times when I work with an organization, you will see that the issue they're trying to address is often connected to some group of people that they are allowing to continue with a certain behavior. Maybe perhaps they're high performers, or they have a certain academic background, or whatever that is. They've been long with the company, whatever that is.
Something keeping them there, right?
Yes. And so you're not dealing with it. So I think the first thing is to really to notice, to not turn a blind eye, but to really notice and see things. And I think the second thing is and for most leaders, I think this is quite uncomfortable. This is challenging for us. We don't necessarily like to point things out, to deal with behaviors give that kind of more challenging feedback. But I think it's so incredibly important that we do. And of course, in the most positive aspect of it, will help somebody who actually wants to grow and develop, will help them to see things that they're doing. And just the other week, I got some tough feedback that were things that I needed to see, I needed to understand, and I didn't see it on my own. It was a blind spot that I needed help to see it. So of course, that's an important aspect of it. But of course, then there are also those times where it's actually someone who's not really necessarily that interested in changing their behavior and who have a very toxic impact on our culture. And that's where I think we need to be ready to take the consequences of that. And then if that is moving a person out of the organization or whatever that looks like. But so many times I talk to leaders that just regret, why didn't we deal with that earlier? Why didn't we act on that earlier? And it doesn't get easier over time. It doesn't get less costly over time. So I think like noticing and then again, giving people opportunities to change and grow, but to make it clear that they actually see the behavior and that it's clear that this is not something that we want to be a part of our culture. And of course, sometimes also to train up this muscles that you talk about, it can be better to deal with it through questions and get people to reflect themselves and so on. But having the courage to do this, having the courage to take that even when it is costly, when it is uncomfortable, and where it might even cost us business, I think that is incredibly important if we want to have integrity of our values.
Yeah, you like we talked about before, if your values are valuable, they're going to cost you something. And we have to be willing to make the right decisions, right? I mean, even creating one of those round tables where some people are, sitting with their other country managers talking, that's cost something, right? That's not directly related to, pushing the top line or something like that. And certainly there are going to be times where defending your organization and your culture from destructive behavior is going to cost you something. But that's why we have values, right? Because we value those things. We're willing to pay something for them, pay some costs for them. And we see that value that we're trying to promote in our organization as more important than the cost that we're going to pay for it. And we as leaders need to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tobias, and then we'll wrap up.
No, I just want to say that I think here that it's so important to just think about trust. And I think every leader understands that trust is business critical. We can't do business. We can't. And if you're a regulated company, I mean, you need to have the trust of your regulators. You need the trust of your investors. You need the trust of your employees, of your clients, and so on, the market. So if you want to have that, if you look at the research on trust, I really recommend people to look at Professor Sandra Sucher's work. She's been another important contributor to our work, and she's written a great book called The Power of Trust. But looking at what does it mean to be trusted? And of course, yes, it's important to be competent. I mean, that's fundamental. But then the other side of it is, are we living in line with our values? Are we having the right motives? Are we seeking only our own self-interest or not? So I think companies have so much to lose from not taking these things seriously. And we see those examples all the time. So it's not like this is something that is just, kumbaya, and it doesn't have anything to do with the financials of our organization. It is very much a business critical issue. And there's this study from Harvard Law that shows that so many people have experienced kind of a trust breach in their organization for over the last few years, and they've actually made the decision, either as a client or as an employee, to stop having relationship with that organization because of that. So this is something we really need to protect.
Yeah, people are voting with their feet and they're voting with their dollars, and employees are voting with their time to go to a place where they have trust, where they can rely on what they're told, where they can have an ethical manager, and they can be a place where they feel like the culture of the organization aligns with their own personal values. And it's something that it's on us as leaders to make sure that we can deliver that, not just to serve and honor the people who trust us with their workday and their paycheck, but also just to achieve our mission, to grow, to be profitable, to grow revenue or whatever it is. It's not separate. They're absolutely intertwined. Tobias, this has been great having this conversation today. I appreciate how what a leader you are. I appreciate your reflections on culture, and I appreciate the way that you've been vulnerable and authentic with your own life experiences and all the things that you've learned to help us learn about building a culture better. I encourage everybody to check out the book by Tobias Sturesson, the You Can Culture. Tobias, how else might anything else you want to say to our audience, or any other way that they can get in touch with you or get in touch with Heart Management?
Thank you so much. And I just want to say that I really appreciate the work that you do at Ethico, and I really appreciate your passion for ethics. And I think that's incredibly clear for everyone following you. And I think that's really inspiring. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. It's Tobias Sturesson. It's not too many people with that name, so you can easily find me there. Also, youcanculture.com. You can find more information on the book. You can download the first chapter there for free, and of course, you can get the book in really whatever online bookstore you like to shop in around the world.
Okay, well, that's been our show. Thanks for joining us. Join us on the next episode of the Ethics Experts, and let's learn.